Hey, we got a call about a male hitting a female and the two of them getting in this vehicle and taking off.
So I
my job to travel across the country, and I'm trying to start a blog, have a blog and stuff. So I've been building my website. So I've just been really stressed, and he doesn't really believe that I could do any of it. So that's kind of been like I don't know. He's like down there. I don't know. We've just been fighting all morning, and.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. It's easy to put words into Gabby Petito's mouth. At 3 minutes into the Bodycam footage, after being separated from Brian by Officer Robbins and standing a discreet distance from the van, Gabby does actually sketch what is going on in the relationship and how and why they are arguing. And so before we get to Gabby in her own words, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So in this image you can see Gabby on the right hand side, her back to Officer Pratt. Opposite her is the Officer Robbins, who's talking to her, and at this stage already a third park ranger is actually on the scene. So Gabby, gesturing and sounding breathless, says, "And I just said, sorry if I'm in a bad mood, I'm really stressed. I had so much work I was doing on my computer." Now, the point of these deep dives is to understand Gabby better, so let's do that. First of all, part of the van life on social media deal is presenting their journey in an attractive way. That means if the van itself is dirty, it needs to be cleaned. If the van is untidy, it needs to be cleaned. If Gabby or Brian appear on camera, they need to be clean and presentable. When you see Gabby on August 12th, she is clean and dressed well, while Brian admits to being, dirty, his feet being dirty, and he does appear sort of dressed like a slob. All of this is so much harder on a hot day when there's lots of work to do. The part that the officers missed is that Gabby was doing her job and Brian actually needed to be supporting her. Think about their situation. They're almost like unemployed newlyweds, but neither of them have any money, and they've decided to try to make money by pitching their experiences on social media. On the day of the Moab incident, Gabby has been working and she's stressed as a result of it. What has Brian been doing? You might think Brian has the liberty to do whatever he wants to do, but in this scenario, it's actually his duty to support Gabby and also pitch in. The van life thing isn't a solo project, and Brian's Instagram is also meant to show his side of the story. And here you have a post from Brian where he says what he chooses to spend his time doing. "I choose to only spend my time in places I don't have to wear shoes." Now, that might sound quite cute, but what do you think Gabby thought about that, how he chooses to spend his time? He also talks about always listening to the Natural Lifestylist podcast when they're traveling. Shouldn't they be doing something else? Shouldn't they be working? And so it means on August 12th, Brian didn't really show up for work. And the inside of the van is a mess on that day compared to how it sometimes, or the way it usually appeared on Instagram. Look at the inside of the van on August 12th. So what do you do when you're in uncharted territory in a career with a colleague who you also have feelings for, you invested in, in a long-term relationship, but has not got the work ethic you have and is in fact disagreeing with you, stressing you out more than you already are stressed out, and distracting you from your work? It's frustrating, right? I think it's even more frustrating if the leader in the work aspect is a woman, money is tight, and the man is dragging his ass. He's dirty, he's sweaty, he's complaining, above all, he's not helping. How do you get him on board? So when Gabby was doing so much work on a computer, what do you think Brian was doing? And now we're at 3 minutes 10 in the audio where Officer Robbins asks Gabby about her work. Robin says, "What do you do for a living?" And Gabby says, "Well, I used to work at an all-organic juice bar, but I just quit my job. I was a nutritionist." And you can see her gesturing with her hands. She's quite open. She's not guarded. She's not deceptive either. She's communicating clearly and transparently to the officer. Now, I don't mean to be unkind, but Gabby's answer to the officer's question is really the rub here. Gabby doesn't really do anything for a living. She's trying to do something. She's trying to find a way of making a living. And that's not hard. That's not easy. It's really difficult trying to make a living, especially now, given what's going on in the world. So where they are right here and now, there and then in Moab, she was actually technically unemployed, not earning an income, and kind of running up, I wouldn't say a huge tab each day, but running up a tab each day. It would be a huge tab each time they drove quite a long distance in terms of fuel, and perhaps also down the line, the expenses for, mechanicals, changing tires, replacing parts. That can also add up. When they ought to have been earning an income, not just Gabby but Brian as well, they were actually spending more. So think about how much money they were earning per Instagram post, per YouTube video, per post on their website, which wasn't really running, and what they were spending each day on breakfast, lunch and dinner, and getting from A to B and paying for this campsite and, just the cost of living, were they able to cover it? So I think it is understandable Gabby answers the question by saying what she did prior to the van life thing. She answers the question, what do you do for a living, by kind of going to what she did prior to what she's doing at this stage, because she's not really earning a living at this point. And obviously she saved up for some time and sold clothing and art on the Depop social media site to fund the trip. But where they are in mid-August, not much is coming in. At 3:20, Gabby says, I quit my job to travel across the country. Robin says, that's cool. Strictly speaking, I'm not sure that's accurate. Gabby quit her job prior to July 2nd, obviously, but it's not completely clear when she stopped working. That would actually be good to know. It's also not clear what impact the pandemic had on her prospects, because let's face it, some of the first casualties in terms of industries and staff were restaurants and waiters. It's even less clear when Brian quit his job and what his work life was in the run-up to the summer epic. What is clear is that both 20-somethings had run out of money by mid-August, despite living on a shoestring, and further, their peers were at college, some of them, I guess, while they were seemingly living the good life, seemingly living the sort of life everyone, including their family, admired and envied. Except this was the reality. This, during the Moab incident, this was the reality. Stress, frustration, fighting, all the while presenting curated happy snaps and idols in various national park type settings, which was starting to make things even more stressful, more frustrating, and leading to more fighting. So this disconnect between reality and the fantasy they were presenting on social media was making things even more stressful, because now you've got to tidy up, not because you want to tidy up, but for this fantasy, but you're still not earning any money from it, right? It probably felt like they were running on a treadmill, getting nowhere, while the audience was in some air-conditioned home or office somewhere gushing about how lucky they were. And that brings us to 3 minutes 22 from the body cam. Gabby, motioning towards Brian, says, I'm trying to start a blog. And so when she mentions that, she motions towards him, and he's obviously had an impact in some way on her starting this blog. Has he helped? What has he been doing? So from the officer's perspective, there's no reason to panic or call out the cavalry. He asks her what's been going on, and they have this conversation. And instead of accusing or blaming Brian for hitting her, Gabby's talking kind of matter-of-factly in terms of what she's saying, but still appearing emotional as she talks about their circumstances. So the conversation isn't really alarming from the officer's perspective. Although she's open and transparent and communicative, she doesn't really let on that they're struggling financially, that the sort of financial peril that they are in, which is a key point at this stage of their journey. So Gabby says, so I've been building my website and I've been really, really stressed. And she clasps her hands together. And he, and that's a reference to Brian, doesn't really believe that I can do any of it. And then she leans down, places her hands on her upper legs, and she says, so that's kind of been like, I don't know, he's like a downer. I don't know, we've just been fighting all morning. And that I don't know, which she repeats twice, is kind of like she's qualifying. She doesn't really want to badmouth Brian to somebody else, which shows the quality of person she is. She's kind of limiting the kind of insult, the negative word that she's saying by saying, I don't know. She's not saying, you know what, Brian is a downer. She's saying, you know what, I'm not having this good experience, and I'm not really sure why. I don't know, I guess he's a bit of a downer. She's qualifying it. She's trying to lessen the sting of that word to some extent. And we want to compare the way that she does that with the way Brian does that when he's talking about her, right? So the other thing that's quite interesting is the reference to fighting all morning. And obviously the person who called in the incident was referring to something that had just happened, something that had happened, 4:30 in the afternoon or 20 to 5 in the afternoon. So they'd obviously been fighting all day, hadn't they? They'd been fighting in the morning and in the afternoon. Now, Gabby's version of events naturally arcs back to them arguing and fighting. And what she says is, he wouldn't let me in the car before, and she places her hands at her hips and looks in the direction of the van and Brian. And Brian is probably watching this from remember, he's alone in the van, he's got nothing to do, and he's probably watching Gabby through the side rearview mirrors, basing his idea, his impression of what is going on Gabby's movements. And so Officer Robbins says, why wouldn't he let you out the car? Let you in the car? And then he actually volunteers. He suggests, well, did he tell you had OCD, right? So that's obviously made an impression in Officer Robbins's mind that Gabby has got OCD. And Gabby says that he told me I needed to calm down, right? So the officer volunteering a reason here why Brian told her what to do, blaming Gabby's OCD, it's not a good sign. It already suggests that the officer is kind of on Brian's side, not on Gabby's side. He's sympathetic to Gabby, but he's sort of starting to, in his mind, put two and two together that Gabby is the reason for this problem, right? Now, although Robbins seems to be quite gentle with Gabby, he also seems to have made up his mind quite early on. Gabby's emotional, and that's the problem here. But isn't she right to be emotional under these circumstances? I mean, their work life is on the line, and if they can't get their van life show on the road, other things may fail as well. This is a situation where the relationship ought to strengthen their work life, and their work life ought to strengthen their relationship, except the opposite is happening. The relationship is fraying, which threatens their work, and because the work isn't working out, it's undermining their relationship. And most of this undermining seems to be coming from Brian. Why? Well, what does she say? He doesn't really believe that I can do any of it. Well, how does that feel? So this is really a tough one, because Brian may have a point almost 2 months into their trip, and they still don't even have a website up and running. As someone who blogged the Chris Watts case throughout 2018 and 2019, I had around 5 million views, while I was running the website. I thought not having their website live 6 weeks into the trip was really slow going. I was blogging at least once a day. They hadn't blogged a single time 6 weeks into their trip. So it kind of puts it into perspective. Brian needed to help make sure that it happened, that this whole thing was going to succeed. He was sort of, one of the most important employees, or he was a co-worker, or he was a partner. But one wonders what they were doing, and that's a reference to both of them. What were they doing during the long nights in the tent and on the days on the road between picture perfect postcard tourist traps? Were they listening to music? Were they listening to podcasts when they should actually have been focusing on what content they needed to be creating that day, each day? So in hindsight, if they were getting some funding support from family, and it seems that they were, the least Brian could have done was be supportive. On the other hand, if the social media thing was falling flat, and it seemed they weren't the right sort of people for that, or they didn't seem to be getting a terrific amount of traction for what they did put up. And personally, I don't think Gabby or Brian were the right people to be influencers. I don't mean that they couldn't have been one day, but right at that moment in time, in August 2021, I don't know if they were the right people to be influencers. You need to be a lot tougher, a lot more thick-skinned, and a lot more hard-working. And so one can see why it may have felt like throwing good money after bad. Brian's impression may have been that this business venture was like a car that is really not working, and maybe you should cash in your chips, kind of thing, and not try and keep repairing a broken car, a car that's not really going to make it. But then they needed to throw in the towel and return home and try something else. If it wasn't working, they needed to try something else. This wasn't just a holiday that was sort of impressing everybody and making people feel jealous. It was actually their job, their work, a venture, right? So if they decided it wasn't working, then they would need to stop doing that and do something else. And so if they didn't do that, then what else could they do except limp along with Gabby doing her best and Brian, perhaps with some justification, criticizing her all along the way. So you can almost see that this was what they decided to do. It wasn't a perfect situation, it wasn't quite working out, so they limped along, Gabby trying to do her best and Brian saying, I don't think it's going to work, kind of thing. But neither of them really wanting to go back home kind of as a failure with all these people watching them. He may have been more justified if he had completely run out of money, meaning Brian may have been a lot more justified that this wasn't working if he had completely run out of money and everything was now her idea and he sort of had to play ball, kind of thing. And he was feeling either powerless, kind of emasculated, or a pawn in her scheme. And perhaps he wanted to be the leader in the thing that they were doing. He wanted to, be the man, kind of thing. Either way, what Brian could have contributed was his support as her spouse. Even if supporting her didn't make complete sense, at least then they wouldn't be fighting all the time. And that then brings us to 3 minutes 49 in the audio from the Bodycam, where Gabby, her voice rising a few octaves, says, "I'm perfectly calm. I'm calm all the time. He really stresses me out. And it's a rough morning." And then she throws her hands at her sides and looks away. And so it's kind of an ironic statement to be saying, I'm always calm, I'm perfectly calm, and clearly the way the officer is experiencing her, his impression is that she's not calm. And she's certainly not calm all the time. In fact, his impression is that she's kind of not been calm throughout. Certainly what she's saying to him is fairly calm and even-handed, but the way she's saying it, she's clearly distressed, right? Although I believe Gabby was typically perfectly calm when things were okay, one can understand the officer not knowing what to make of her and of the situation, and perhaps taking that statement with a pinch of salt, given Gabby's unsettled emotions throughout her explanation. We're now at the 4-minute mark of the Bodycam 1, and the second officer hasn't arrived yet, but he's about to. And I think it's because he arrives, and when he arrives, and Officer Robbins can see him arriving, Robbins feels he needs to do something. He needs to take action. Effectively, the arrival of the second officer cut short Gabby's story at the very moment she started opening up about Brian, why they're arguing and what's going on. So that's quite an important point to highlight. Think about that. Gabby's just spoken about herself and why she's emotional. She's kind of given Robbins all the ammunition he needs, kind of thing. But she hasn't spoken about Brian yet. She hasn't kind of been afforded the chance to talk about him. And when he does come up the first time, the second officer shows up, and the first officer starts taking action, and there he is, showing up. And he parks his vehicle behind Officer Robbins. And Robbins says, with this vehicle pulling up, well, why don't we do this? And he's effectively cutting her off. She can't now say any more than what she said. Why don't I set you down in the back seat of my car? You're not in any trouble, okay? And Gabby blurts out, okay, kind of quite tearfully, right? And then Robin says, okay, I'm not going to be putting any handcuffs on you. You obviously don't have any weapons. I'm going to get you into the air conditioning. I think the reference to her not having any weapons, I don't think Brian is sort of asked that. There is one point where he asked him to lift up his shirt. I can't remember if that was for weapons or for injuries, but one almost has the impression that it's still that Gabby's the perpetrator here. Gabby has wounded Brian. You know, is she carrying a knife or something? Obviously not. But anyway, he's kind of being quite kind and considerate, allowing Gabby to get out of the heat and, you know, get a little bit of air conditioning and kind of calm down. But there's another reference to the heat of that day. That was definitely a factor. And he says you can take a breath, relax a little bit. And obviously he's aware that Gabby's been tense throughout. And there you can see the officer, Officer Pratt, in the background. He's walked from his vehicle. He's on his way to Brian at this point. This actually seems like quite a good strategy if you think about it. Give Gabby a timeout on her own. Allow her some time to calm down on her own, in terms of her emotions. Just put her alone and just let her just kind of calm down. That said, with 3 to 4 police officers on the scene, I don't think it's going to be easy for anyone to be not to be anxious. I mean, imagine you're in a situation and officers are going to decide whether you're going to be arrested or not. Do you think that's going to be easy to manage your feelings? You know, you're going to be uncertain. Anyway, Officer Robbins says, and then I'll come back and talk to you in a few minutes, okay? Gabby says, okay. Robbins kind of flippantly says, alrighty. And then at the moment that Robbins tells Gabby he'll be back, Officer Pratt appears in the background heading towards the van. There he is. So at this moment, Officer Robbins is about to leave Gabby to go and talk to Brian, and it's almost at the same time that the other officer, Officer Pratt, is going to talk to Brian as well. And there's also a third officer who's going to talk to him. Now, I don't know whether that was part of the police strategy, that all 3 of the officers would confront Brian at the same time. I doubt it, but who knows. In the scheme of things, the timing was fortuitous for Brian, but quite unfortunate for Gabby. And from our perspective, with the benefit of hindsight, what would have been preferable is if Gabby sat inside the cruiser and Officer Robbins continued to get her story, perhaps offering her a bottle of water first, meaning getting her story about what was going on for Brian, right? What was important to happen here, as we saw in the first analysis, was for Officer Pratt to ask his question to Brian, have enough time to speak to Brian, give Brian the opportunity to answer, and to answer directly to Officer Pratt. So for there to be a one-on-one with Brian, just as there's been a one-on-one with Gabby, right? That is what was needed. Instead, as soon as Officer Pratt started talking to Brian, two other officers joined him, and one of them was Robbins. And so Brian was able to kind of fragment his answers, able to, between the three officers, kind of not really answer what he was being asked. And it was harder for the officers to figure out his side of the story, initially anyway. And you've also got to bear in mind what was happening, what was Brian seeing, and what was the impression that was being created while the second part of the issue was being resolved, which is what is Brian's part in the story. So I do think the fact that Gabby was taken aside first gave Brian a certain impression, also gave the other officer a certain impression of the direction that everything was going. And I think Brian took kind of his cue from that Gabby was the one that was actually in trouble. So, as I said, Brian was able to fragment his answer, but by far the most information that had sort of come through at this point was that Gabby was emotional, and by her own admission of being OCD, that should actually be by her own admission had OCD. And so that is kind of going to count against her, because Brian's not going to say anything about himself, that, oh, I can get quite angry, that I'm quite a controlling guy, oh, that I'm jealous, oh, that I'm worried that my girlfriend's going to leave me at any moment. So counterintuitively, the pendulum swung early on towards Gabby. So I'm not going to take us through the officer getting Gabby settled in the van, but he basically just walks her back, opens the door, lets her in. You can see the two officers over there talking to Brian. They've only just started talking to him for like a couple of seconds. And then about 30 seconds later, moments after Officer Pratt and another officer had just started talking to Brian, Officer Robbins appears at the passenger door, and Brian breaks off from both officers to make eye contact with Officer Robbins. This is really something you want to watch live to appreciate just how hyper-vigilant Brian is. The moment the officer appears at the door, Brian breaks off and directs his attention to Officer Robbins. And it shows you he was obviously watching him in the side view mirrors, right? He was watching what was going on with Gabby, saw Gabby being chaperoned into the vehicle. Again, this happens, he looks at the officer the precise second that the officer appears at the passenger window. He kind of ignores the other two officers and immediately addresses Officer Robbins. And yeah, you can actually see his hand is actually directing backwards towards Gabby, kind of with his thumb, saying, and this is what he says at this point, he says, let's just go to that part, he says, did you speak to Gabby? So I think three things are worth noting at this point. Number one, Brian has been watching Gabby interact with Officer Robbins like a hawk, using both side view mirrors to do so. He's seen Gabby not only gesticulating and crying, but gesturing occasionally towards him. And who knows whether he can hear some of what she's saying as well. But I think the gesticulating plays to his advantage. Perhaps he knows that. You probably don't see the officer turning around to look at Brian when she's gesticulating. She's probably saying, I've been very upset, I've been very upset. And Brian can use that to his advantage. Number two, Gabby's discussion ends with the officer placing Gabby inside the vehicle, inside his vehicle. And then number three, Brian had to have assumed from this that Gabby was likely the one in trouble. And he was off the hook, potentially off the hook, or at least in less trouble than she was. They'd obviously kind of picked on her first, and she was clearly in some kind of trouble. So there was also no question that his driving was the reason the officers were on the scene, and that was probably some relief to him, because he literally had been breaking the law in a number of areas, crossing a double line, speeding, and hitting the curb. And if they were focused on that, he'd be the one in trouble. So at 4:45, Brian, addressing Robbins, thumbing in the direction of Gabby, says, there should just be one you there. Did you talk to my fiance? Robbins says, what's that? Robbins has just arrived there. So he's barely arrived at the door when Brian addresses him, so he doesn't even quite hear the question. And so Brian repeats himself and says, did you speak to Gabby? And it's quite interesting that he refers to her as my fiance. Anyway, Brian says, did you speak to Gabby? And Robin says, yeah, I just spoke to her. He's not really disclosing what the conversation entailed or what Gabby said about him. And that's kind of police procedure. You try not to let on what you know in order to get your suspect to say something that is going to contribute to your body of knowledge. I think the worried look on Brian's face here speaks volumes. You can't really see it so much in this particular screen grab. It's at 16:48:57, but if you play the video, Brian looks quite, almost kind of unhinged here. So Robin says, do you want to do me a favor? Let's have you step out of the vehicle. Brian, sounding enthusiastic, says, yeah. And so, yeah, you kind of have Robin's taking charge. The other two officers are kind of like bystanders in this. And at this point, Officer Pratt has already given up talking to Brian, and he's heading to the cruiser to talk to Gabby. Well, he will eventually talk to her. At this point, he's kind of just heading back. So much for Gabby being allowed a timeout to calm down. Certainly doesn't last for very long. So we're now at the 5-minute mark, and now with Gabby inside Officer Robbins' vehicle, Brian has his turn explaining what happened to Officer Robbins as well as the park ranger, who is wearing a mask and is also present. Now, one way you can listen to this is you can play the audio, you can play the YouTube video of me narrating this while going step by step through the video of the raw video, the raw body cam. That's one way you can follow it without just seeing the script all the time. Because that is the way I'm going through it systematically, chronologically. Anyway, Robin says to Brian, why don't you come over here, motioning to the back of the van, and then says to him, you're not in any trouble right now. And that is also giving Brian a bit of information that is leading him to make certain assumptions, right? Which may have, and this is very early on, it's just 5 minutes into more than well over an hour's worth of body cam, right? And anyway, this I think is an unnecessary disclosure to Brian, which immediately indicates to Brian that Gabby may be the one in trouble. This is what Brian's wondering. And so when Robin separated Gabby from Brian, the vibe was completely different. Think about that. 2 or 3 minutes earlier, when Robin separated Gabby, it was far more serious. You know, he speaks onto his radio saying to the dispatcher, I have the female, and says nothing to soothe Gabby prior to asking her what happened. But Brian is told, you're not in any trouble right now, now you tell me what happened. So he is able to take that and run with it, and kind of assuming Gabby is the one in trouble, put the blame on her. And isn't that what happened? So Brian has been told now for the second time, you're not in any trouble. The first time was when the officer took his keys. And so at this point, Brian is asked for his version of events, and Brian is quite nervous here. There's no smiling, there's no duping delight. Brian is now far more than when Officer Pratt asked him. He's got one officer to deal with, and he doesn't know what Gabby has told him, and he doesn't know that Gabby hasn't actually told him very much. So Robin says to him, so tell me what's going on. And at this point, Officer Pratt, who's been hovering in the background, turns and heads to the cruiser where Gabby is cooling her heels. And Brian, you can kind of quite clearly see the left side of his face where he has this apparent injury visible. And bear in mind, Officer Robbins couldn't see Gabby's injury because her injuries were on the driver's side, you know, to her arm and to her cheek, right? So that's the other thing. Brian gets the benefit of his injury being seen first, and this further takes the narrative in a particular direction. In any way, in any event, how Brian answers is he says, she just gets worked up sometimes, and I try to really distance myself from her. And one wonders whether these words are any kind of explanation for what happened in Wyoming just around 2 weeks later, right? That did Gabby get upset about something that Brian wasn't supporting her, and then something happened, and then I tried to really distance myself from her. Now, before we deal with the content of Brian's answer, just look at the impression he creates compared to Gabby. He's dressed like a slob. He's average looking, and the first thing he does is pin the blame on Gabby, right? Compare just this impression of Brian to the impression of Gabby, how she's dressed and how she addresses what has happened. She doesn't immediately blame Brian. She kind of provides context that she's been stressed, she's been working on her website, and she even blames herself. And I do think he does seem appropriately nervous here, and he sort of stutters, and he sort of walks in a kind of a disconnected way, and his hands sort of move around. He does seem quite nervous, and he should be. He should be nervous. And so this is what Brian says. He motions towards the van, and he says, I locked the car and walked away from her. What happened this morning, and he knows that this is the issue because Officer Pratt said that someone called in something where a male was seen striking a female. That was the one sentence Officer Pratt got to Brian. And so Brian immediately diffuses that, saying, I locked the car and walked away from her. And then he jumps away from that. Right? This is something that obviously happened at the Moonflower Co-op, but this is something else. What happened this morning is she's trying to set up her own little website, you notice, blog and everything, and like every time, and then he interrupts himself. He was about to say something there, and I think if the officer could go back in time, perhaps he would have said, what were you going to say there? Every time what? Every time she sets up her blog, what? Did she need his help? Did she need his help with design? Did she need his help with setting up a web page? Every time she did that, was there an argument? Anyway, he then says, we really had a nice morning. And if anything, she got worked up. Well, that's not what she said. She said that they were fighting the whole morning, and obviously still into the afternoon. So right now, Officer Pratt is in the background again, consulting with the park ranger, right? You can see him, well, you can't see him there. You can see him there. And there's another image where he's literally talking with the park ranger. There he is. And you can see Brian sort of wringing his hands and not making eye contact. You can see in virtually none of these, in 1 out of the 4 screen grabs, he's making eye contact. He's making eye contact there, but not there, and not there, and not there, right? Now, before we deal with the content of Brian's answer, just look at, as I said, the impression that he creates. And then I want to also talk about, if you look purely at Brian's body language, clasping his hands, he seems and sounds insecure, and worse, he makes virtually no eye contact with Officer Robbins, unlike Gabby. There's also no smiling or duping delight from Brian at this point, because the outcome is still undecided. The self-interruption shows he's trying to tailor what he's saying, and this is already a contradiction to what Gabby said. She said, as I said, we've been fighting all morning. Who do you believe? And so I'm going to play out with the original audio of Brian speaking and the original footage. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.
I'm in trouble right now. So, tell me what's going on.
She just gets worked up sometimes, and I try and really distance myself from her, so like I locked the car and I walked away from her. What happened this morning is that she's trying to start up like her own little website blog and everything, so I give her time. I mean, we really had a nice morning, if anything, but she just worked up because we were trying to get going and get our day going because we want to go like barges before they set the time.
Okay. You want to tell me about those scratches on your face?